Hello, welcome back to Manic Minds. This week we're talking about anxiety. So, if anything to do with surrounding anxiety is quite triggering for you, then please do reach out to somebody who you trust. There should be some links below the video to some services that can help as well. We are aware that the audio is a little bit crackly at times. We've got new microphones and testing them out this week, so fingers crossed by next week it'll actually be much better audio quality. But thank you very much for watching. We hope you enjoy.
So anxiety, eh?
Oh, fantastic. I'm so looking forward to this. Really sorry to just quickly take away from the seriousness, but since we like to play random object of the week, I'm just going to get rid of this week's random object of the week.
Yeah. So anxiety, eh? Yeah. So yeah, one of the more common, I guess, conditions or disorders, however you want to put it. I think it's something that everyone can relate to, at least to a certain extent.
Yeah.
But I think the big question is always, how do you differentiate between everyday feelings of, anxiety when we all get a little bit stressed, a bit panicked about things that are coming up that we're not looking forward to. But then also looking at just anxiety disorders and when that can really start having a huge impact on your everyday life. So I think that distinction is really important to sort of begin with.
I think probably the way I would view it would be that if you just get anxiety, like in kind of everyday, like, going to sit an exam, something like that, that's being nervous. Like, yes, it is anxiety, but it's what everybody experiences. It's nerves.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, when I think anxiety, I think more like disorder over nervousness.
Yeah. I think it's important not to get too bogged down in terminology sometimes. Like, if that, whatever you feel when you're having an exam coming up, if it's stress, if it's worry, if it's fear, if it's panic, like, I don't think those words particularly are that kind of important to sort of identify. I mean, the fact that you could say that what they're experiencing is pretty much anxiety. It's because it's become a bit of a buzzword, I think, because it's so, I guess, common, widespread. People think they sort of understand a good deal about anxiety, and I think, like you were talking the other day about how people kind of use words to do with that are more traditionally to do with mental disorders. It's a kind of, it's my OCD playing up. It's whatever.
Statism, that kind of
statism, yeah. But we all know people who will say, that's maybe feel really anxious, or that's really anxiety inducing, or I'm getting a bit angsty now. I think that's quite common. It's just coming down to terminology and how we use language and how language sort of evolves over time, which is not what we're obviously here to talk about predominantly.
Yeah.
But it's another good reminder to people maybe who are listening that sort of use those terminologies, and maybe they've had people come to them before and kind of explain that it was offensive to them for a matter of reasons. So, but I think you're completely right about I guess how we would sort of define anxiety. Like, it very much.
I'm really sorry. I'm thinking about the fact that Shakespeare invented the word hobnob and now it's a biscuit. I'm so sorry. My mind wandered away. Right. Okay. And now it's out. I'm back. I'm back in the room. Sorry.
Fantastic. Another example of how language can be.
There you go. That's where that's how it popped up.
Yeah.
We'll discuss dolphining in another episode.
But no, I think you're right. Obviously, when it comes to the definition of anxiety, it has a lot to do with feelings that we're all familiar with: feeling nervous, feeling stressed out, panicked. I think for me, like the best way I would explain anxiety, and again, not coming at this from a clinical perspective, like we have some sort of different levels of training in this, but we're not professionals or
training
qualified. Yeah, but I always see it as it's the mind and body's reaction to some kind of threat. And when you put it that way, you could say, well, that sounds like quite a logical reaction.
Yeah.
So I guess we've all had situations. You step out of the road too quickly and don't realise a car's coming, so you just quickly step back and you feel panicked. Your breath changes. Your blood pressure is all over the place. And I suppose it's when you start to look at how that affects people day to day. Like, I suppose if someone says, I'm really nervous today, and you say, oh, do you know why? And they say, yeah, it's because I've got an exam coming up. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a perfectly natural reaction to something that you're
or interviewing for a job, things like that.
Yeah, exactly. But I suppose when it gets down to the sort of disorder level, it's about what that person perceives as threats. So you start getting to the point where the things that they perceive as threats aren't necessarily things that other people would perceive as threats. So, an example: somebody suffering with social anxiety. The idea of having to go out to a party in full of new people in a group setting really terrifying for some people, whereas others would just take it in their stride and just deal with it. So it's an individual thing. It's your individual relationship to anxiety. I think is important here.
I was thinking about from an evolutionary point of view, how obviously being anxious makes sense. Back when we were worried about saber-toothed tigers. Whereas there's a big difference between it going off for a saber-toothed tiger, or even like you said about stepping out and not realizing a car's coming. Right, okay, everything that happens to your brain then all perfectly rational for no matter where your brain sits on the scale of neurodiversity. Whereas just going and popping up the shop at the top of the street, that's in my head. I'm like, that's where it starts to become more like right, okay, there's a problem here. There's something more going on than general just day-to-day anxieties of modern day life.
And it's interesting you brought up evolution and stuff, because there's schools of thought out there that say that somebody who would be diagnosed with a sort of general anxiety disorder today, back when our lives were sort of very different, like prior to the agricultural revolution, where we were still kind of hunting and gathering, and the threats to us were a lot more real. That kind of person probably would have thrived, actually, because they were the most prepared for dealing with threats. And that's another point as well. It's that we've got to remember that our physiological, biological makeup hasn't changed nearly as much as our way of living has changed. We weren't originally people that domesticated animals and plants and things. We were used to walking around, and we weren't top of the food chain. We had a lot more threats than we do now. And it's not unreasonable to kind of assume that our brains just haven't developed that quickly. Which I know it might not be particularly helpful for anyone watching past generalized anxiety. So you would have been great thousands of years ago. But
I promise we'll get to the helpful stuff.
Yeah.
To be honest, I was kind of curious, where your experience with anxiety. It's do you remember your first experience with anxiety? Or
I think one of the a big memory in school was being feeling very self-conscious, almost like that, being in that anticipated state of something's going to happen here that's not going to be good for me. Someone might make a comment about me that's going to knock my confidence, or I don't know what it is. Or meeting new people, especially. I've never been particularly good at that. I come from a bit of a family unit where mum very outgoing, willing to meet new people, kind of life of the party often, and I'd be in situations where she's talking to her adult friends, and I'm just a kid sitting there thinking, there's kind of things I probably want to say in this conversation, but I'm too scared to say anything. Obviously, back then, without knowing, the actual mechanics of anxiety, I just thought, well, clearly something wrong with me, but I don't know what that is. I think it's shyness. When a kid doesn't speak much or doesn't interact much, it gets brushed off as shyness.
I'm thinking, that stereotypical, the kid who hides behind their mum and pops their head round the side. But that's what I'm thinking in my head. For when it comes to children with anxiety, that's what you think of, the shy kid.
And childhood. If we talk about that sort of perceived threat and anxiety being a reaction to a perceived threat, then childhood is a time in your life where the opinions of others matter a lot. You constantly feel like you're going to be judged going into the school playground. Just, how you wear your clothes, how you speak to people, the kind of people you hang around with. There's a lot there about trying to fit into to some group, just for acceptability, which everybody wants to certain degrees. So, it's not it's not unusual for people, going through childhood and teenage years to maybe sort of feel their anxiety a bit more severely.
Just on that note, though, because I had a very different experience with anxiety, I didn't have anxiety at all till I was 20. I went right the way through school with no anxiety, like no issues, didn't have everything that you've just said there, did not apply to me. I kind of wanted to put that point in because I didn't want it to be a situation of people going like that wasn't how it worked for me, because obviously everybody's different, and for me that very much wasn't the case. Like, I literally had never experienced anxiety at all till I was 20. I got up, went to go out my front door, put my hand on the door, and physically couldn't open the door. Like, as in, my brain could not get my arm to move. I was standing there holding the door going, well, open it then, dickhead. And just something in the back of my head was going, we can't open the door, we can't open the door. Like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. I like, well, but if we step outside, then like this is going to happen and that's going to happen. And it was playing like wild scenarios that like would never happen. Like, genuinely think like saber-tooth tiger style wild scenarios. Like, that kind of thing. Whereas going through school, like, obviously I had times where I was nervous, but I've also never been a nervous exam sitter or anything like that. Like, I just kind of got by in school without any anxiety. And then just like say 20, bang, out of nowhere, really anxious. And I know for a lot of people their experience is more like what you've just said there, like quite anxious as a child, anxious in their teenagers, like because of social conditioning and all that shit, and then carries through into adulthood. Whereas for me it really was, I just had always been a confident, outgoing kid.
And that's important because like you say, every person's experience of it is different, and as difficult as it is for someone who's sort of experienced it their whole life, it can be really distressing for someone like yourself that never experienced it before, and then all of a sudden it's just hit them.
I didn't even know it was anxiety. Because I'd had no experience with anxiety. I was just like, what is happening? My heart was beating really fast. I was starting to feel really dizzy. Like, my vision was going blurry. I was sweating like there was no tomorrow. I was like, what is happening? Like, I feel like I'm about to faint. And he got us back home, and as soon as we got back home, I calmed down and I was all right. And then I was in therapy at that point anyway, and I went into therapy and I was like, this happened. And they were like, yeah, that would be called a panic attack. And I'm like, but I don't suffer with anxiety. And they were like, well, you do now. I'm like, fantastic, love that for me.
I mean, it's important to know, like, maybe not so much in your case, but for a lot of people, anxiety can develop after something quite sort of traumatic. So following grief, for example, like losing a close family member, having like an injury, like retiring as well. I imagine, like, just a complete change of lifestyle can cause a lot of anxiety, because again, you're having to step out of a kind of a world that you recognise and are comfortable with, and suddenly everything's different. And that's scary. There are a lot more threats around you, so of course your body and your mind are going to start reacting to it. So I think that's a important thing to note as well. Maybe we could talk a little bit about where anxiety disorders can come from, perhaps. I mean, there's lots of different schools out there. But
I'll be perfectly honest with that one. That's a you thing, because this isn't my forte.
Well,
you want to talk voices, bipolar, EUPD, I'm all good. You want to talk anxiety, that's on you.
Well, I mean, it's important to note that there's no one definitive answer to it. I mean, there's lots of different theories. I mean, it could just be, I say it's simple, but it could just be like as simple or straightforward as the fact that, as a kid, you grow up in a household with anxious parents. Because we all know that children pick up on things, especially when they're like really young, like the way people talk and behave and react to things. Like, kids watch it, copy it. So that would be what's called acquired anxiety. So, like, not something you're born with, nothing to do with your genetic makeup or your brain or anything. It's just that's what you're used to.
So essentially, I'm very well aware. I'm clarifying that I'm understanding here. Like, would you say more kind of like genetically predisposed and then something environmental triggering, essentially?
Well, so this is what I call the chicken and egg sort of argument, I guess, about where anxiety comes from, because there are schools of thought that are more genetics based. We're born already predisposed to certain conditions, so anxiety disorders would be one of them. But then environmental factors we know play a part as well. So it's always that question of, what comes first? Is it the genetic makeup that makes us predisposed to feeling threats in the environment, or is it things that have happened to us? And that's a bigger question that I'm sure a lot of philosophy students would have a lot of fun with.
Yeah. Not one we're going to tackle today, though.
No, probably not quite enough time to go into that.
Because again, my language thing will be here for 7 hours.
yeah. So yeah, I think lived experience certainly, but then also genetics, neuroscience, are different sort of factors that come into play as well. Definitely should stress that I'm not a neuroscientist, and my knowledge of that is fairly limited. But from what I do know, simple MRI scans of brains with people who have anxiety disorders are really telling. The part of the brain that deals with fear and dealing with threats, I suppose, is a lot more, or tends to be a lot more kind of active in people that have anxiety disorders. There's actually an experiment where people who were already diagnosed with social anxiety, for example, were shown pictures of people that they didn't know, so like complete strangers, and there was more activity in the amygdala, I think it's called, the fear center of the brain. Yeah, it's quite interesting.
Yeah. So, like, realistically, then it's, because I mean, obviously, but most of us, when we're meeting somebody new for the first time, will be a little bit anxious, no matter who it is that you're meeting, whether it's your friend's friend or partner's parents, or going to an interview, something like that. Like, naturally you're going to be a little bit like, oh god, like, I hope they like me, kind of thing, essentially. But stranger on the street who you don't interact with, who you walk past, most of us don't even acknowledge that we've walked past somebody, or if we do, we'll acknowledge someone's coming, but once they've passed, then then you're fine. Whereas I'd imagine for someone with social anxiety, it's a bit more of a like, oh my god, kind of feeling.
I mean, to a certain extent, everyone has like a bit of a frail ego sometimes, and other people's opinions of us do matter as much as we try to make them not matter. Like, it's difficult in everyday life, and again, it will be an individual thing, like different experiences. So, me, for example, like I'm not too bad at talking in front of people. Like I can give a talk in front of like a full room. If I know exactly what I'm talking about, like I'm the only one talking, that's always a good thing. A little bit of a PowerPoint presentation as a bit of a comfort blanket, I'm kind of fine with that. But then introduce me to a brand new person and then leave and let me interact with this new person, it's really difficult. Maybe not so much one-on-one actually, but like in a group setting especially, because there's all these people that you're already thinking, what's their opinion of me? How are they perceiving me? If I say something, am I going to look even more stupid? If I keep quiet, are they going to think I'm weird because I'm not talking? Like, all those questions sort of rush through your mind when you're in that kind of setting. So very tiring, actually.
Can imagine. So, because for me, that's like not been my experience throughout life. Like I can stand and give a presentation in front of a room full of people, but even then, like the presentation that I would give most of the time, I haven't got notes or anything like that. I'm glancing up at what slide I'm on, and I can just go and I can talk about it in a group setting with people I don't know. I'm all right.
Yeah.
Like that's not been my experience, but I can imagine that if literally that little anxious voice in the back of your head is on repeat all the time, thinking, "Oh my god, they're going to think I'm strange. Going to think this. Going to think that." That's quite mentally exhausting.
Oh yeah. And it's all about, again, that preparation for something you perceive to be a threat that's coming up. So, like for me, like that's my idea of a worst nightmare, just going into somewhere and just talking off the cuff. Like I would have rehearsed it 1,000 times in my head before I actually present it to the public. That's how it kind of differentiates with different people.
That is actually really interesting, because there's been times like where we've maybe been and done something like that, and you're like knackered afterwards. Like even recording, you're knackered afterwards because you're mentally exhausted, whereas it doesn't mentally exhaust me. And that's interesting because I've never really taken into consideration more why that might be the case.
Yeah, I think anyone with a socially anxious friend like needs to appreciate that their social battery is going to be a lot
Mhm.
shorter when they're
Yeah.
in that sort of situation. Like it's so draining to have to, I don't know, just like always sort of constantly watch yourself and be vigilant of what you're doing around other people, like through fear of what they're going to sort of perceive you as. Um, I think you recognised that in me quite quickly, didn't you? Like the first time we were in a social setting outside of work, it was
Yeah,
his
like
social batteries flatlined.
yeah, like Christmas party. I mean,
Mm.
like obviously we've been sat talking, and then had a few drinks, and I think around like midnight, you were like, "Yeah, I'm off."
Yeah.
And I think I got home at 4 a.m.
Yeah.
Fell through my door actually. But yeah, like that's. I mean, like I said before, my experience with anxiety has been something very very different compared to like yours, and it's interesting because I only understand anxiety through my viewpoint, which has never been a socially anxious kind of thing. Like claustrophobic a little bit sometimes, but never socially anxious. Like you could literally drop me in a room full of people that I've never met and I'll have three best friends an hour later because I can quite happily walk up to somebody and I will find something to talk about. I think again, like that first time that we hung out outside of work, I said, yeah, you have to talk to me because I will keep talking at you until you talk back to me. That's just the kind of person that I am.
Yeah.
I will force a conversation. If I'm bored and I want to talk to somebody, I will find the nearest person to me who I think is interesting and I'll go talk to me.
Yeah, yeah. But then equally, like what you were talking about before, you know, it sounds like some form of manifestation of agoraphobia, not being able to leave the house, or well, that's not the exact definition, but
I think for me, a lot of my anxiety linked to my psychosis.
Yeah.
To be honest, which is probably why, as my psychosis got better, my anxiety got better.
You want to learn more about her psychosis? There's another episode on our YouTube channel you can check out. It's very highly recommended.
Yeah, go back an episode.
We're up to 13 likes.
I'm not gonna lie, I didn't check. After we had to re-upload after the bleep incident.
It's not good.
The deafening bleep incident.
But yeah, and you know, agoraphobia in itself is, you know, again, if we look back at DSM, anxiety, agoraphobia is a recognised anxiety disorder. So, like social anxiety, generalised anxiety are the two most common ones that people talk about, but there's lots of different types. So, agoraphobia being one, phobias as well. I think we've both got certain degrees of phobia towards certain animals.
Certain degrees an understatement in it. But I mean, even that, like, I mean, that's something I literally learned this morning when we were talking about recording for talking about anxiety. That phobia is a form of anxiety. That's not something that had ever crossed my mind. I'm like, a phobia is a phobia.
Yeah.
It's not related to anxiety at all. But then I suppose, I mean, taking mine's rats. When I go near a place that I know the likelihood of me seeing a rat increases, my anxiety goes through the roof. You know, the alley round back the office.
Yeah.
After finding out that there is rats in that alley on a regular basis, the few times that after that I went in early or had to leave late and had to come out that way, it was just not okay. Like I was literally like running through the alley because I was petrified.
Even that, I mean, you know, people could say, well, there's a certain logic to that. Like, you know, you got a phobia of rats. Obviously, you're going to avoid certain places where you know they're going to be. Like mine, you know, my big one's bats, and like I get fear from just seeing a bat on TV. And like, if you really broke that down, that's completely illogical, really, because that bat cannot hurt me. It's not. It's not even in the same room as me. Like, but it's still, you know, the association of seeing it kind of triggers something. But
I'm really sorry. I'm only giggling because I'm thinking about when we watched Beauty and the Beast before it started. You were like, "There's no bats in this, is there?" And I was like, "No, there's not." And then as it got to it, I was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I lied." There's like a 2-second with bats. I apologise.
That'll be a common thing for me. If I'm watching a movie I've not seen before, I will ask the person, "Are the bats?"
Yeah. So I mean, realistically, then, if you're talking about different types of anxiety, I mean, I think a lot of people can probably relate to social anxiety and generalized anxiety. So, I mean, in terms of, for lack of a better word, controlling it, bringing it back down, not letting it control you, what are the kind of steps there? Like what's
Well, I think before we get into that, like that specific question, I think it's important to recognise that different levels of feelings of anxiety warrant different types of treatment.
Mhm.
So before you mentioned panic attacks, and that's a very common thing for people to experience if their anxiety is, for want of a better word, kind of out of control.
Yeah.
You know, I remember seeing it. If I find it, I will link this video to this video because I can't quite remember who said it or where it came from. But I was watching a bit of a talk on like the different levels of anxiety. So she kind of separated it into 3 levels. So from the lower level, it's when your anxiety affects sort of parts of your body that you do have control over, but you sort of only if you're sort of conscious to think about it. So everyone can, I guess, relate to being a bit fidgety when they're nervous. You know, like the fingers playing around. Big one for me is like leg bouncing.
Yeah,
as well.
I know a lot of people who do
Always
that.
happens. And those sorts of symptoms will happen when you feel that sort of lower level of anxiety. And if you actually consciously thought about what you were doing, you could just stop you from bouncing if you wanted to, or you could like do something with your fingers that's gonna sort of stop them from being so fidgety. But then when you get into higher levels of anxiety, so you know when a heart rate starts to increase and you can feel like that sort of pit in your stomach and those sorts of things, like that's a lot harder to actually do anything about in the moment.
Yeah.
Because it's your body sort of getting to that further level, getting further away from, you know, just like the here and now and the sort of reassurance that actually you're okay, you're just perceiving something that might be a threat. And then, you know, panic attacks are kind of like the extreme end of that, where the way she put it was everything kind of goes offline. So like your vision gets impacted, your hearing gets impacted, you have that ringing in your ears, and yeah, your vision goes blurry. So, you know, if we want to talk about treatments, and I think it's important to differentiate between what it is you actually, you know, experiencing. So, yeah, I mean, from the lower end of things, if we, especially, you know, I'm deliberately started talking about fidgety fingers because a really common sort of little coping technique that people use these days are, you know, fidget toys.
Yeah.
Something to do with your hands, just to kind of take your mind away from the fact that it's so fidgety. Anything like that. Anything that sort of helps you to feel a bit more in your body, I think, as well. You know, there's really good things that you can get these days that are actually quite accessible. So like weighted blankets and things like that.
And just say on that note, if you're going to get a weighted blanket, it needs to be no more than 10% of your body weight, as I discovered when I got one that was more than 10%, and I get stuck. I am stuck to my bed when I've got my weighted blanket on. It is so unbelievably fucking heavy.
See, I didn't know that, so that's quite useful.
10% of your body weight max.
Awesome. Yeah.
Otherwise, you will get pins and needles and start to go a bit numb after a while,
Yeah.
as I found out the hard way. I learned this so you don't have to, okay?
And then, yeah, when we get into the higher end of things, so if someone's experiencing a panic attack, like fidget spinners aren't going to do anything. You know, like meditation's not going to do anything. Like you've got to find a way of, you know, getting yourself back online, I suppose, to sort of regaining control as best you can of your, you know, your senses. I guess is probably the best avenue towards it. So, really common technique. I know that you've used it a lot and you've experienced it. So the 5-4-3-2-1 technique, like that, that's all designed to get you back into a sense of like, right, I know where I am. I'm actually okay. You know, these like my thoughts are spiraling away from me. I need to sort of try and stop that somehow. And this is where this might lead on to like more of a kind of a mindfulness discussion. But you know, the 5-4-3-2-1 is very much grounded in mindfulness. You know? Like, so for anyone who doesn't know, it's tell me 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can hear, 3 things that you can smell, you know, etc. Different variations of it, but you know, that's essentially the principle.
Do you mind if I just take 2 seconds just to explain that a little bit further? Just because that's my number one go-to skill when I can feel myself getting a little bit worked up. And I mean, it works very well for anxiety, but it also works very well for other heightened emotions as well. So 5 things you can touch, 4 things you can see, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can taste, 1 thing you can smell. Those are interchangeable depending on your surroundings. I change mine depending on where I am. Like, for instance, if I'm on public transport, I don't really fancy touching like too many things around us, making it obvious what I'm doing. So I'll put it at a number which is within a reasonable amount of, like, I can touch the things that I'm already quite close to without it being obvious. If I've got headphones in, then I'll drop the hearing down, that kind of thing. Like, I'll change it to work appropriate to my surroundings.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and different things that work for different people. I find it really comforting. This is just a bit of a random example, but like if I'm holding a hot mug of tea or coffee or something, just like gripping onto it and feeling the heat of it is really grounding and relaxing for me. So yeah, I guess it's just about testing things out and seeing what kind of works for you, I guess. Yeah.
Kind of like an empty your brain thing, isn't it? Like, you've got to empty brain, be present in the moment, which mindfulness.
Yeah. But also, like linked to all this is the point I think that is worth making, that whilst it's a mental health disorder or diagnosis, whatever, like it's a very physiological experience as well. Feeling anxiety. So what we talked about before, the heart rate, breathing, sweating, how you feel in your body, like, matters so much. And yeah, like these sorts of techniques are really good for that. So recognizing, right, I'm feeling very hot right now. How do I sort of cool off a little bit? Do I need to sort of take myself out of the situation and go somewhere just to cool off a little bit? Yeah, that sort of thinking, really.
I know a big one I had for quite a long time was nausea, like, as in physically, and to the level of physically being sick.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going back a few years. That's when I worked in like call centers and stuff, and there was points where I would be physically vomiting every morning before work, and I knew it was anxiety.
Yeah.
But I couldn't do anything about it. I just had to keep telling myself, you're all right once you get there. You just have to get there.
Yeah.
It's the getting to your desk and logging on your phone.
Yeah.
Once you're logged on, you'll be all right. But then every time I had a break or a lunch break, I had to do it again.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's that horrifying feeling where, and I mean, especially if you don't know that it's anxiety, it's even worse, because you start thinking like, oh my God, what's wrong with me? And I mean, speaking from a woman's perspective, it's even worse if you get nausea before work every day, because you start panicking, go, why am I feeling sick every morning? But like, there is a lot of times where that is it's your body. For me personally, it was my body manifesting what I wasn't allowing my brain to be aware of. I wasn't allowing my brain to go, hey, I'm anxious, let's work through this. So my body was going, oh, I'm going to tell you you're anxious.
Well, that's a good example of how our minds and our bodies can be in different places. That is quite common, I think, with anxiety. So I remember when I first started going to meditation sessions, like I spoke to the guy who led it, because he was talking a lot about living in the present moment and experiencing the here and now. And I thought, that all sounds fine, but surely there's got to be times where we do need to be in the future. Like, if we're planning something in the future, how do we kind of go about that? And what he said to me was, okay, imagine you're planning a trip to Birmingham. You're not in Birmingham yet, are you? Like, all the steps you have to take to get there, you do now. You buy your train ticket here. You don't buy it when you're in Birmingham already. So it's like, you, like with your example, so your mind was kind of already at your desk and panicking about it when you weren't actually there. So then that threat becomes completely kind of fabricated by the mind. It's not a real representation of what it's going to be like when you get there. I think that's really important, that sort of distance that can happen with our minds and our bodies. And again, mindfulness, we're talking about that a lot today, but that is a good technique of being able to bring everything back to the center. So
I mean, for me, my anxiety disappeared as quickly as it came. It literally just went away. I mean, don't get me wrong, I have what I would call normal levels of anxiety in day-to-day life now, but it did literally disappear as quickly as it came, and it was from the whole going, don't think about it, essentially, like, which I'm very well aware is easier said than done, but we're all familiar with the Sunday night blues. That like feeling of, oh my God, I've got to go to work tomorrow. I got really good at being like, that's a problem for when I'm actually at the door. like I know even back end of last year, beginning of this year, when I was still working from the office, and it was like a case of I did not think about work until I was actually in work. I can remember being on the phone one morning and somebody saying to us like, "What have you got on at work today?" And me being like, "I'm not talking about work yet because I've got another hour till I start."
Yeah.
So like we're not discussing work right now. And that was just how I learned to cope with mine.
Yeah, yeah. And talking about techniques, I mean, I know that in CBT, a very common thing people use to battle anxiety is like exposure therapy. So you ascertain what the client is particularly fearful of, and then you find a way to sort of gradually, slowly put them in those situations because, they would argue that the most effective way of dealing with a threat is to kind of face it in a way that still keeps yourself safe. There's no point jumping into the deep end with these things, but exposing yourself to situations that are a threat to you. So again, easier said than done, but social anxiety, well, it could be so how far do you think you can push yourself to put yourself in situations where you kind of have to speak to people? And if you can do it bit by bit and sort of record the progress you're making, that can be a really effective way of dealing with it.
So with like that, for example, say for argument's sake, making a phone call to make a doctor's appointment makes me extremely anxious, for argument's sake. Would something like just hitting call, letting it ring once and then hanging up, and building up slowly that bit be like a good starting point? Because I know especially for like our generation, we are the generation whose phones live on silent, and we will watch a call ring out and then Google the phone number before we ring back and find out. Like that's just like how it is. But I mean, like that phone call one, especially with ringing the doctors, that's the one that I personally have seen me have to make doctor's appointments for multiple friends on a regular basis because they can't physically do it themselves.
Yeah. Really difficult to get across to somebody like who doesn't experience that, like why that's such a fear for people. Because a lot of people just look at that and go, "What's wrong with you? It's a phone call. Just pick up the phone and talk." But it doesn't work that way. But yeah, that's a good example. I mean, again, it's an individual experience, and you sort of find what's going to work for you in conjunction with your therapist, obviously. But it could be that, or it could be that for the first few times you have to ask someone that you're close with to kind of be with you when you make that call, and then gradually like try and do it independently. Whatever works for you, really. But I think that's why I wanted to bring in exposure therapy, because it kind of links to what we were talking about the the threat is kind of over here. We're not actually there yet, but our mind is kind of like chasing it.
Yeah,
it's going down that rabbit hole of, oh god, this is going to be awful and scary. And the more familiar you become with the sorts of things that you're scared about, can help.
Yeah. No, that's interesting, because it's not really something that I'd ever. I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't sit on the side of like, what's the matter with you? It's just a phone call. Like in my head, I'm like, it's just a phone call. Like it's fine.
Yeah.
But I understand why that could make somebody anxious. Like because you don't know. And I mean, I don't get anxious making phone calls, and I've dealt with enough people where I've come off the phone from, for example, making a doctor's appointment and being extremely pissed off because they're just fucking rude. Like, so if you're already, self-conscious and anxious and stuff like that, and then somebody like you just get through to the wrong person, for argument's sake, like another human being essentially, that would just exasperate that next time that you go to make the phone call. Right, well, I was anxious anyway, but look at what happened last time. It's reinforcing the idea, kind of thing.
Absolutely. And I think the best way to address that is to like really think it through and really be aware of the kind of things that you do have control over and the things that you don't have control over. So you have no control over who's going to pick up the phone. You have no control over how rude they're going to be to you. But you do have control over how you deal with it, as hard as it might be. So you have the ability to question that anxiety and say, well, okay, the last time I called somebody and someone was really rude to me and it was a horrible experience. It doesn't have to happen again.
Yeah.
No.
Would you say that, for argument's sake, with like for that, if we stick on the topic of the phone call, because I know how common of a one that one is. Say, for instance, if I'm really anxious about making a doctor's appointment, but I've got a close friend who I know would be willing to let me practice, and I can call them and practice making a doctor's appointment. That kind of thing. Like, which I'm very well aware a lot of people are going to go, oh my God, but I don't want to do that because like that makes me feel silly. If you pick somebody who you trust and say to them, hey, you already know I struggle with this, would you mind helping me out here? Any decent friend's going to go, no bother.
Well, that's where, you know, people's empathy skills and understanding comes into play, you know, and like, unfortunately, not everybody has that level of empathy where they're going to be like, yeah, of course I'll help you with that. They're not going to, you know. But then again, you can't control that. Like, you know, you can to a certain extent. Like, people who have anxiety might be drawn to more confident people because they know that they're going to be a bit more protective of them when they're struggling with it. But at the same time, you've got to, if you're going to do that sort of role play situation with someone, you've got to do it with someone you fully trust who's not going to judge you, or at least if they do judge you, they're not going to say it out loud to you. But it's a good parallel because again, go back to the feeling nervous about an exam situation. You know, you could say to a certain extent, anxiety can be quite a useful thing because if you're sitting there and your exam's a week away and you feel really anxious and nervous about it, that might be an indication that you just need to do a bit more preparation. You know, so that revision that you do before an exam is very similar to that sort of role play thing of I'm really anxious about making this phone call, but I'm going to do it in a sort of, you know, a revision type scenario where I'll do it with a friend, and if it goes badly, it doesn't really matter. I can have another stab at it. You know, yeah, that works as well.
That's actually really like insightful and interesting because, like I say, I mean, I've had experience with anxiety, but I don't really have a lot of experience with like social anxiety, especially. And just on the point of what you said before about like being drawn to extroverts, like I have actually noticed, and I mean, this is a common thing you see go around on like social media as well about like introverts don't make friends and extrovert comes along, likes them and adopts them. Like it's like, I mean, a lot of my friends are introverts and suffer with social anxiety. I'm very quite outgoing and quite confident, and I mean, a lot of them do call me and go, hi, I need help with this because it's making me really anxious. Like, and it's me who they call because I'm the extrovert of the group. That kind of thing.
There's always that question, isn't there, of you know, to what extent do you allow that to happen? So, you know, using another sort of mundane example, like we saw like that meme that I think we shared with each other the other day, where it's like, why do like easygoing guys date women who are quite confident and forthright? And it's it's because someone has to tell the waiter that I asked for mashed potatoes, and it's not going to be me. So, and you know, it's very useful to have people like that in your life. But then I suppose people say, well, what if they weren't there? You know, you can't fully rely on them all the time. So there has to be something within you that you kind of have to cultivate to say, well, if I am in a situation where I have to speak to somebody that I don't know, can I do it?
Well, that's curious then. So if you were with someone who like would do that for you and be like, yeah, I'll speak on your behalf when necessary, but then you out with a group of people where nobody's going to do it for you, would you just eat the chips instead of the mashed, or would you say to the waitress, sorry, I ordered mashed potato? I'm curious. Sorry, I'm just out of curiosity.
No, I mean, I'd probably eat the chips. If I'm perfectly honest. I think
a lot of people would though.
Yeah, within reason. Like if you ordered a pizza and they gave you a
lasagna.
Or like for me, like if I was, you know, I'm a vegetarian, so if they messed up and gave me a meat dish, obviously I'd have to say something because I'm not eating that, and I'm not wasting money on it. But little things like that you think, oh, it doesn't really matter actually. Like I can have chips when I order mashed potatoes, it's not a big deal. Like,
I mean, like I've got a friend who he gets really anxious, really socially anxious. He'd never told me how bad the anxiety was at first, which, you know, in itself comes its own problems because if the people you're closest to don't know how, like, don't understand that you get anxious, sometimes it can come off just as you being arsey, for lack of a better word. And or like, you know, or just a bit kind of frustrating to be around if somebody doesn't understand like what you're going through. And I mean, his big one is he doesn't like opening a door like if we're going in, like say a pub, a restaurant, whatever, he physically does. He can't open the door, and I remember like him literally just stopping dead in front of the door, and I was like, dude, are you gonna go in?
Yeah.
And he just like, and I'm like, I need you to like vocalize here to me what's going on, because from where I'm stood, it kind of looks like, in The Sims when they go into a room and they just forget what they're doing because you've cancelled their action. That's like from my perspective what this looks like. Obviously, from his perspective, it's the anxiety, the heart beating fast, the sweating, because he can't physically get himself to open the door. Little did I know that all I needed to do was, in that situation, is I go in first.
Yeah.
Because I will open the door and walk in first. No problem. Same with if we're ordering food. He doesn't like ordering his own food. He would prefer for me to speak for him.
Yeah.
So now when we're out, I will always say before the waitress or the waiter comes, I'll always go, are you ordering or am I ordering for you? And then if he wants me to order for him, I'll be like, right, what do you want?
Yeah. And that's a really good way of dealing with it as his friend, I think, is like firstly acknowledging what he's going through, and then like giving him a bit of ownership back of the situation of like, okay, so would you rather me order, but no, I can definitely relate to that, and especially just what you said there before about how people perceive someone who's been really anxious. So a big thing for me was I'd just go quiet in conversation sometimes, like even if it's like with people I knew, like we were in a group of friends and I was kind of fine for about half an hour, and then a thought would come into my head and it's like they're all judging you and what you say next really matters and all this, and you just suddenly go quiet, and like you say, it comes across as just being a bit arsey. And I've had friends come to me and be like, what's wrong with you? Like, you were fine half an hour ago, what's going on? And like, but they're not actually asking, they're sort of accusing me of like being
like what the fuck's the matter with you?
Yeah, exactly.
Like rather than hey, what's going on?
Yeah.
Comes back to language.
Yeah, well, exactly.
And tone.
I think it's useful. I think there might be people listening to this that have friends that do things that they think are a bit weird. Maybe like let's learn about what's actually happening behind that. Why can't your friend go into a restaurant first? Like.
I mean, my own personal experience, not only as in like someone who's got friends, like a lot of friends who are very anxious, but as in watching people with anxiety actually open up to the people closest to them, or like having conversations about what was the reaction when you explained, like, this is how anxious I actually get. 9 times out of 10, the response I've always had has been like, oh, it was like a weight off my shoulders, and now I don't get as anxious because it's understandable. Like, I know some people have like little code words between them. Me and one of my best friends, we've got a word that we can say to each other that we just know that means, hey, my social battery's done, I'm anxious, I need to leave.
Yeah.
Like, just something that can be slipped into any normal conversation that nobody else would be aware of, that between me and them, we know that means, hey, I need to go.
Yeah.
Like, just little things, like kind of back to what talking about on last episode was about being transparent to a certain extent with people you trust, obviously. Like if you look at someone, you go, hey, I know for a fact you're going to react badly if I tell you this, then maybe it's like, let's not tell that person that.
Yeah.
But if you've got somebody in your life who you can talk to them.
Yeah, definitely. Another common one for me is I'm planning to go out with like a friend, and at the last minute they say, oh, is it okay if so and so comes? Like, I don't know so and so. Like, this was never a part of the bargain, and being able to explain that to someone who doesn't quite get it is really difficult. It's like, oh, actually I'd prefer if it was just us or whatever. But if you have that understanding friend that knows that might be a bit of an issue, so my advice for people in that situation is give that person plenty of notice first.
Not like 5 minutes before meeting, hi, I've got so and so with this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not even an anxious person, and that pisses me off.
Yeah. That's where we get into the sort of terminology of avoidance behavior. That's something that's really common with people with anxiety. They exhibit a lot of avoidance behavior, which again, to a certain degree, is logical. It's like, well, obviously you'd want to avoid dangerous situations. And if you think that situation is going to be dangerous, doesn't matter what other people think, for you, that's a dangerous situation. A logical thing to do is to hide away from it. And then, it's not that much of a stretch to start to think, well, that's going to impact on your day-to-day life. So, people that can only go to restaurants with that particular friend that will talk for them if needed. Like if they're in a situation where they're going out with someone else, that person's not available. What do you do? Do you avoid the situation completely? Or do you, expose yourself to it? And there's no easy way of saying whether like people should do one or the other. It's a personal thing. It's something to explore in therapy. But it's I know again from my experience, I know that avoidance behaviour can be quite detrimental to sort of just day-to-day enjoyment of life. Really.
Yeah, I mean, I just using the ordering your food example. Years ago, I was like that. Like when I was really badly anxious, I couldn't order my own food.
Yeah.
And for me, it came from a frustration. That's how I got over being able to order my own food.
Mm-hmm.
You've seen me get hungry. It's not fun for anybody involved, including me. And we're having to wait for somebody else to go and do it for us. Pushed us to a point of going, do you know what? I'm getting angry because they're not doing what I want them to do when I am capable of doing it myself.
Yeah.
And that was like the mental barrier for me personally. Mine just came from the fact that I get really hungry. I really should be in the Snickers advert. But I think sometimes it's a balance of pushing yourself slightly out your comfort zone. But sometimes that's easier to do if there's a reward at the end of it.
Yeah. I suppose my thought on that would be that, okay, so if you're someone who doesn't enjoy public speaking, if you're someone who your lifestyle, the things that, your career, the things that you do don't necessitate you doing a lot of public speaking, I wouldn't necessarily push someone to be like, you've got to get good at public speaking. But if it's something that you enjoy, but you just know that part of that thing that you really enjoy involves meeting new people and talking to people, that's where you might think, well, there's an actual benefit for me if I got this under control,
So I mean, like I'm just thinking about starting to wrap up now. So I mean, I've got one final question, but before I ask, is there anything that you'd like to add?
I think there's a couple of things we could maybe talk about, like you asked about different coping skills and treatments and things, and I thought maybe sort of bringing in medication might be a quick thing to discuss quickly. So we've both got experiences of medication. So probably the most common medication that people would be given by a doctor with if they had anxiety disorders is what they call SSRIs. That will essentially affect the sort of levels of serotonin in your brain and things like that, and it's a neurotransmitter that sort of regulates those sorts of moods. The jury's very much still out on medication. Some people really swear by it. Some people tried it once and would never do it again. Some people are just naturally quite fearful of it. And I would always recommend primarily discussing it with a professional, doctor, therapist, whatever. But I know that in my experience, it is quite an effective leg up. Not going to solve your anxiety. You're not going to take a pill and suddenly not be anxious anymore, but it will give you the sort of oomph and motivation to start doing something about it kind of longer term, I think. So I don't know if that's similar to your experiences, but
I mean, I took propanol, and it was very much hey, like here's these, you can take up to 3 of them a day. But I remember the doctor saying to us, use them as and when.
Yeah.
Don't take them don't take 3 a day every day, because if you're not anxious, don't take them essentially.
Yeah.
And very quickly I realised how very effective they were for getting me over the hump kind of thing. Like, what I said before about feeling sick before work.
Yeah.
If I got up in the morning and took one of them, I could get right the way to work and through my first couple of calls before my brain went, hang on, we were anxious about doing this morning. And then I'd be like, but now that anxiety is no longer relevant because I'm here, I'm fine, everything's okay.
Yeah.
So it gets you past that physical, like you say, the proper sweating and feeling like you could be sick. That was like my experience with medication. But I mean, I've not had anxiety medication in years now.
Yeah. That as well, another thing I wanted to touch on is again, thinking about coping skills and strategies. So another thing you have to consider is whether it's a short-term strategy. So there are things like benzenes that you can be prescribed as well. So if you have particularly severe panic attacks, like something just to bring you down in that moment can be quite helpful. But then there are other techniques that are a lot more about long-term work as well. And a big thing about different techniques like this is whether you're being proactive or reactive to things. So if you know, for example, that mindfulness really helps you, are you only using mindfulness when you need it, or are you trying to fit it into a sort of daily practice so that you're, in theory, more prepared for when things happen that you can't sort of anticipate? So that's another question I would consider as well when thinking about what's going to be effective for you. And just to touch on some other things as well. So, mindfulness meditation is a whole thing. We'll probably do a big video on it at some point as well.
Definitely, because I know we've both got experience and some very good opinions on mindfulness. So definitely would like to have a conversation about that at some point in the near future.
Yeah. But it's, it is interesting to know that a lot of these commonly known techniques stem from mindfulness. So the 5-4-3-2-1 that we talked about. Another one is box breathing. It can be quite effective, especially if you're in a very heightened state. So literally controlling your breath. So you breathe in for, you count in your head for 4 seconds. There's different variations of it, but one I do is breathe in for 4 seconds, hold it for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds, and then leave another 4-second gap before you take your next breath in. If you do that for a couple of minutes, that can be very effective at just bringing your body back to,
Interesting. I'd never even heard of that one. I mean, obviously, a lot of my coping skills stem from more like DBT, so more like to do with personality disorder and that kind of thing, and like regulating mood. So there's a lot of things to do with like general anxiety coping skills that like I've not even heard of. And that's one. Box breathing. Right.
Box breathing. Yeah. And then other things, like journaling. The reason why journaling is effective is because, again, if you think about what's happening when you're experiencing an anxious episode, your mind isn't in the present moment. It's ran off into the future and is already anticipating and trying to battle threats that haven't even happened yet. And a really good way of trying to regain control over those spiraling thoughts is to have some kind of a dialogue. So whether that is with someone else, like, some people can be very effective at calming people down in the moment to say, right, what's going on? What are you anxious about? Like, talk it through step by step. If you don't have somebody like that all the time, then journaling is a way of doing that with yourself. So you could, for example, write down all the things on one side of the paper that you're particularly worried about or stressed about or anxious about, and then using sort of the other side of the paper to challenge those thoughts a little bit as well. So I'm really anxious about meeting this new person because they're going to think I'm a weirdo, like, their opinion of me is not going to be great. So you think, okay, so what's the evidence of that? Like, does that typically happen when you meet people?
Yeah.
If they do think you're weird, how does that really affect anything? Like, I'm still me. I'm not going to change just because one person thinks I'm weird. Just having that kind of internal dialogue, I suppose, with you. So that's why a lot of therapists recommend journaling for anyone who wanted it.
Yeah. I know one that was recommended to me, which is very similar, was like the breaking your piece of paper down. So you would write down what you're worried about and then break it down to 5 minutes after the fact, like after the incident, 5 hours after, and 5 months after. And then if you need to go further, you can, and do 5 years as well. But say, for instance, I'm really worried what my best friend's friend is going to think of me. Use that one because I think they're going to think I'm a weirdo.
Yeah.
Right, okay. If they do think I'm a weirdo, 5 minutes after I leave that, what impact does that have on my life? 5 hours after, what impact is that going to have on my life? 5 months after, 5 years after. And that, for me personally, was a really good way of making me go, hey, actually, even if that is what they think, it doesn't actually affect my life, so there's no need to be worried about it, kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the sort of introducing logical thinking to a logical thought process. If you want to put it that way. Yeah, and I think again that's another reason why my personal opinion is that medication and therapy work really well together in conjunction, because there might be a lot of people listening to this thinking like, well, I can't even get to that point. Like, I'm so anxious, I can't even leave the house, let alone like analyze what it would be like to talk to someone new. And if you can find something like the right medication that works for you, that gives you that, like I say, that bit of a booster to kind of get out there and have the ability or the ownership of your own mind to be able to do this sort of work, and that can be really helpful. And it's always going to be an individual experience, and it really just depends on the extent and the severity of your condition, which is why there are different sources of help out there. It could just be something you could talk with a therapist about every couple of weeks, or it could be something that a psychiatrist or a psychologist would be more equipped to deal with. So yeah, it's as much as we're talking about our own lived experience, I think it's important to remind people that your experience is your experience.
Yeah, exactly.
And find what works for you. So, yeah, definitely. I think another benefit, I suppose, if you want to say that, is that a lot of people can relate to feeling anxious. So it's just, if you're someone who gets particularly anxious the day before an exam, just remember how that feels, and then appreciate that some people kind of feel that every single day of their lives.
Yeah.
And that hopefully should help with the bringing a bit of empathy and understanding into the situation. So yeah, just don't judge people too much. Don't be a dick. Have empathy and understanding towards people.
So basically, what like that expectation for just life in general, just don't be a dick, and you're good.
We can kind of end every episode like that. Yeah. Try not to be too much of a
Print it
dick.
on a shirt or something.
Yeah, there'll be merch available soon.
Yeah. I was going to say, you say that, another bloody won't be. We haven't got time to be doing that shit.